All right, this is Buppie Biolog number 2. I want to talk about two schools of music thought. Um, there's the. I was thinking about this today at work. There's the approach coming from technique, and then there's the approach that comes from learning through example. I think the classical approach, the music education approach, is the technical approach, the technique. So you learn the technique of the instrument, how to technically play the instrument, and then that teaches you how to read music, and you can replicate music that you read, because you have the technique of the instrument, and also you can play the instrument from a technical point of view, right? And then there's the approach which is learning individually, like learning each instance, like each song, what's going on, a case by case basis, context, and so like learning by listening or watching a video tutorial and then learning individually. And there are pros and cons of each of these styles. Personally, I think I've learned most from the second. So I started as a classical bass player, upright bass player, like orchestral player. And I was taught the classical way of thinking, read the music, and this is the technique. But I think I learned more about music from the second approach, the contextual approach, I'll call it, the contextual approach, which is when I just started to learn songs and learn how to play individual songs in terms of what was going on. I think having a technique, like a basic foundational technique, is important for being able to learn anything. Like in the case of music, learning like key signatures and how to play notes helps you learn the technique and how to play contextually, right? But I think it's kind of interesting because on piano, I've learned a lot of things just by learning songs, and I've been like, okay, in this spot, what would I do to play this from like the most, like what would feel the most natural and the most clean from a technical standpoint for the context of this song. And I think that is interesting. That is an interesting approach because I think the learner, someone who seeks to learn and understand what they're doing, will make connections. And so if I learn something in one song, like a technique, with the contextual approach, I feel like you could be like, oh, I've learned this in this context, but now I'm doing something different, but it's similar, so I can kind of apply what I've already learned. Whereas I feel like from a technical approach, it's not as transient. It's more like you learn everything on a case by case basis because you're reading it. I guess you could still be like, yeah, I've this what I'm playing here is like a pattern that I learned in this other song, so it can still have its place in that. But I think it's really cool when I learn a technique for one song, and then I'm playing a different song, and it's like maybe it's the way I like move my thumb, like shift my thumb on the keyboard or whatever, after a certain combination of notes. It's like, oh yeah, this is just like this other song I've learned or whatever. I think that's pretty cool. So, yeah. I also think the classical technique doesn't teach it doesn't emphasize transient thinking or thinking across different contexts. It's kind of just like, all right, this is the major scale, this is A major, and this is B major, and then this is like E flat major, right? But I guess that's the accountability goes on to the individual musician who's playing the instrument. I don't know. Like, I feel like I had to implement those tools myself in order to become a better musician. I was taught all these major scales and whatnot from a classical training. And then later, I had to figure out, like, oh, here's how I would use these. Like, I'm right now, I'm even just thinking as a bass player. I'm not thinking about piano at all. Like, I was like, okay, I learned all these scales, how to play these scales or whatever, key signatures. And then, in the context of a song, it was up to me to figure out how to implement that technique or that key signature or whatever. Like, how would I want to use it? Or like what notes to choose for a certain or for a certain song, right? And also, I think that's where improvisation comes in as a very useful tool, which is I think improvisation at its core is really just the musician's ability to take everything they've learned before, like all of their previous prior knowledge, and like their pool of prior knowledge, and to pick and choose from that pool to match the context of the present. So, which can be practiced, right? I think that goes into the contextual school of music. So, yeah. To recap, 2 schools of thought in music. There's a technical approach, the classical approach, and there's a contextual approach. The experience or learning from each individual context. And there is overlap, of course. So, yeah.